But my main task is to introduce our guest professor, Professor Craig Sheridan from University of Wits,
Yeah.
South Africa, who combines his research, archaeology, geography, chemistry, the environmental sciences, who will talk about water-related issues. And I'm also very keen to and curious to hear about it. So it's Craig, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Piotr. So Sarah, I'm just going to check before I do anything. Is it working, and can you hear me? All good. Okay, brilliant. Okay, let me just try and get this out of my screen. Okay, not working. There we go. Okay, so thanks for that very nice introduction, Piotr. This lecture is based on my inaugural lecture, which I gave a couple of years ago. And I'm going to talk you through it. And I think in many ways it is a slight personal journey. And it's my journey as an academic from a very strong technocratic space as an engineer and a scientist towards where I think our disciplines need to progress, which is in many ways sort of beyond that, beyond the faculty or beyond the school concept. So that's the first caveat, is that this is based on my inaugural lecture. And the second caveat is that this is also not strictly speaking a technical lecture. So it's more of a story, I guess. So I hope you find it interesting. If you came for a hard science lecture, we're not going to have that today. So today's lecture is called Into the Wild. It's water research as an interface between science and the humanities. And I have many references to Into the Wild, which was a novel and a movie by John Krakauer. So I named this lecture after the novel. And to give some of the context, the novel is a story about a young man called Christopher McCandless, who rejected the world as it was to forge his own path. And he paid a very dear price for doing this. In the novel and in the movie, he assumed an alter ego called Alexander Supertramp, and he used this identity to explore the wild. So I first saw this movie almost 2 decades ago, and I remember feeling profoundly disturbed, but I did not know why. So I've revisited this movie many times, and I've read the book many times too. And I believe it describes a lesson, and the lesson is simple. It's of how to reject those parts of the establishment, in this instance, those being things such as academic silos, and to reject them because they do not make sense, but yes, it also provides a really stark warning of the dangers of doing so. There is also a secondary analogy at work. Alexander Supertramp got trapped in the wild by water. Now, I'll come back into this theme a little bit later. So to start off with, this is a photograph of Johannesburg, or the Joburg I remember as a child, including the trolley buses. Part of the history of this period was fearsome drought. This was well documented, even in papers like the New York Times, where there was a document with older farmers who remember a devastating drought in 1933, said the one that is now gripping Southern Africa is certainly worse. A South African cabinet minister insisted it was the worst in 2 centuries. As a consequence of this drought, I became aware from a very young age that water was scarce and had significant value. The story of South Africa is one of drought, flood, drought, flood. All of the science, not politics or other domains of human knowledge, emphasizes that this cycle is amplifying. It's getting hotter globally, droughts are getting worse, and floods are getting bigger. So how does this relate to me as a researcher? So my education as a chemical engineer at Wits was really important for me, I guess. And the reason I feel it was important was the degree was very 20th century heavy. So what do I mean by that? Well, what we did was we learned to convert coal into other materials, such as petrol, or how to liberate metals from rocks, amongst other things. This was a very useful and big focus, but even back then I felt something was missing. Something to do with the environment. And my reasoning was simple. Chemical engineering is all about creating useful products and materials for the benefit of humankind at large scale. Products can range from petrol through metals, through plastics such as polymers to pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, the economic models, which we still use and apply for all plant costing, externalizes the environmental cost. In other words, we never really pay full cost for our products because the true cost of disposal and environmental protection is never really included in the product. The environment always pays that price. But the other thing that chemical engineer teaches is how to see systems and feedback loops. And the problem with teaching people how to see systems is that they start to see systems. And the nice things about systems is that they're complex, they flow and they ebb into each other. I then completed my degree at Wits University, in fact, and I spent some time at other universities and I got some experience in the working world, most specifically as an environmental consultant. Part of my personal dismay with this working world was that I did a lot of environmental assessment and reporting of this, but it never led anywhere. I assessed many sites, I found substantial environmental impact, and I wrote many reports. But in truth, I don't think any of these sites were ever remediated. On occasion, there was an attempt to clean up a bit, but the lack of real engagement was very depressing. And to be fair, sampling for contamination on a site just outside the boundary wall, people are burning plastic cables to expose copper for sale to recycling is also quite demoralizing. You get strongly left with the sense of what's the point? I'm trying to do good while the air is being poisoned at the same time. The chemical engineer in me, the one that saw systems, observed this and shelved this information for later use. Specifically, I started to observe the link between environmental degradation and poverty. And I was starting to see some of the parts of much bigger systems at play. I was then very lucky. I was given an opportunity to become a lecturer at Wits University in 2010, and I used this opportunity to conduct research. Around this time, there was a presentation given at Wits on public publishing, and in fact, it was someone from Science or Nature who came to our university and said, really, the gist of their presentation was that if you want your research to have impact, you need to be researching something that impacts society. I've always had a very strong sense in water, a strong interest in water, and continuing to research water made sense since my PhD was on remediating effluent. I previously observed that wetlands are able to purify effluents, and I was intrigued by this. They always looked beautiful and had the secret hidden benefit of purifying wastewater. So I set out, and these are big parentheses, naively as it turns out, to try to understand how this happens. And it turns out I'm still trying to understand some of these mechanisms. But water was an obvious domain for me to conduct this research. At the time, as a chemical engineer, there were also two other very obvious themes for me to consider. The one was acid mine drainage, which I spoke about last week, and the other one was constructed wetlands to treat different elements. So I'm going to separate these out for now. I conducted initial research on constructed wetlands for treating winery effluent. The study had two thrusts. One was trying to understand how the fluid flowed in the constructed wetlands, and the second was trying to model the rate of degradation of the components of the effluent. Turns out that they work quite well for certain types of effluents. This led to a research program to determine effluents, which effluents we could treat, and the mechanisms of this treatment. We treated mine effluents, and we successfully removed chromium. We also observed that wetlands became blocked, so we started to try to understand why they were blocking and how to overcome this. Obviously, if your treatment system is blocked, it doesn't work. During this period, I was also fortunate enough to do the conceptual design of the greywater treatment constructed wetland at the Vodafone Innovation Centre north of Johannesburg. Following on from this design, I collaborated with Andrew Thatcher, who's a professor in the Department of Psychology, to assess how people engaged with the constructed wetland. The findings were very interesting, certainly to me. The technical manager had a very different understanding of how the system worked to the cleaner, and both of them had a different understanding to what mine was as the designer. Most importantly, of everyone who used the system, the cleaner, who was a very nice lady, had the greatest potential to destroy it. She used bleach to clean the basins, and if you throw bleach into these living systems, they tend to die. So my realization at this point was that as designers and engineers, it's our responsibility, and I use that word very carefully, it's our responsibility to engage with people. We must do more than just design, build, and sit back. We conducted further research into the hydraulics of these systems, and I'm particularly showing this page, which is from a paper with lots of really horrible equations to show that we went very deeply from a mathematical modeling perspective to understand how the fluid flows within these constructed wetlands. And again, collaboration was key. We had mathematicians and environmental engineers for collaborators and input, but we also relied on fundamental chemical engineering theory. And based on this, we decided to expand this research into the physical world. So our statement at this point was, perhaps these could work in an unplanned urban context. And I want to take a moment here to define what is meant by unplanned urban. In South Africa, we call these types of settlements informal settlements. I contest this definition on the basis that these settlements are not informal. Where we were doing this research, some of the homes have been in existence for more than 20 years. Many are now brick and plaster structures. This is formal. What these settlements are is unplanned, which is why we're calling them unplanned. I believe this affords the residents who live in these settlements a dignity which is denied if we call them informal. In exactly the same way, I try not to use the word community, as in community engagement. Again, because this differentiates us from them on the basis of the community where you hail from. And I find this obstructs meaningful engagement, certainly at least in my head when I'm trying to work with the local people. Therefore, I did it well there. I try to call the community the local people, but this is a much harder habit to break than calling them informal settlements. So we were very lucky. We applied for EU funding from the Water JPI, which is now called the Water for All. And we were granted funding from these three different organizations, which is the BMBF, FORMES, and Water Research Commission. And we designed this project called URBWAT, which was accessible greywater solutions for urban informal, you see, we haven't changed our nomenclature yet, urban informal townships in South Africa. So when you have a look at what these places are, what we find is this intersection of multiple interconnected water issues. We have, I'm going to put my pointer on, laser pointer. We have sewage, which comes out of blocked sewers. There's a reason many of these sewers are blocked. It's a socioeconomic reason. We have, and this often comes from a formal or a planned suburb adjacent to your site. We have above ground, we call them portaloos. They're often used in building construction sites. These belong to the people that live in the local inhabitants, and that would typically serve for 4 people, 4 families, 4 homes. But you also have this access or this issue with stormwater because there is no planning. So stormwater backs up and it builds around your site. In addition, we worked at this location, which is called Silvertown. So this is in a suburb called Alexandra, which is just north of Johannesburg and just east of Sandton. Sandton is the economic hub of Africa, for those of you who don't know. This suburb here is called Silvertown, and the reason it's called Silvertown is it was initially built with silver corrugated iron shacks. And this is the Yixgay River, which is the primary drainage river for Johannesburg. It flows north into the Indian Ocean. And for geography, this is the disused wastewater treatment plant. And then this is called the greenhouse, which was a donation from Gift of the Givers following a flood in this river basin a few decades earlier. But what I would like you to see is how rapidly this context changes. This photograph on the left was taken by aerial satellites in 2019. And the photograph on the right is taken in September 2020. So this is about 18, 19 months later. These little yellow markers, which are quite difficult to see on my screen, I hope they're easier to see on yours, are where we built our wetlands. But what you can see is that this entire region just north of our site became built up during this period that we did our research at. So again, this is really difficult from the perspective of urban planning or design. How do you manage this kind of rapidly changing urban context when you're trying to prevent pollution in the context. So anyway, notwithstanding this, we went in, and specifically the first thing we wanted to understand was what was the impact of this settlement on the local river. So this is Chris and this is Michael. Chris was my postdoc and Michael was one of my master's students. And we did a whole lot of sampling both upstream and downstream of this informal settlement portion. And what you can see is the blue stars, I guess they are, is the amount of E. coli in the river before our settlement, and then the red is after, or the orange is after. And you have orders of magnitude increase just from the small settlement. This is upstream, and this is downstream just below here. So, and this is a river. So we have massive changes. The reason this data is discontinuous is that actually we had a number of instances where there would be security risks, so we were not able to access the upstream sample, and therefore we would not take that. But it doesn't matter whether it's continuous or not. What we can see is a very clear indication that the river has, the community or the settlement has an enormous impact. So part of our project, we had a go, no-go marker, and the first one was, could we build it? Could we have access to the site? Would we be able to get people to buy in? So we did what we call co-design, and we brought in the local inhabitants, and there's a workshop area like a community hall, and we had workshops, and we try to understand what they would want from an urban drainage or an urban wastewater treatment system. And it's very clear what they want is what everyone else has, is they want sewers. They want the water away from them as quickly as you can possibly get it. We hadn't proposed to do that, therefore we were not able to build this. So we worked with these ladies, and they were all ladies. I must also emphasize this. We worked with these ladies to say, well, what can we provide instead? We were proposing these wetlands, and we said we would do that. So we chose 3 separate sites. We had phase 1 and 2, which were CW1 and CW2, and then we came back later and we built CW3, constructed wetland 3. So we had phase 1 construction. This is wetland 1 and wetland 2. And I want you to notice the design, how we have this drainage area. We then have, we don't want pumps because they either block or they get stolen or they get broken. So you have a little bit of gravity flow. And we have local construction materials. These are reclaimed bricks. And we have some plastic liners, and we have a gravel bed filled with wetland plants. So the only thing that came from external to our site was the wetland plants. We bought them from a commercial nursery north of Johannesburg. And we were quite happy with this, except 6 months later, we saw they were dead, entirely dead. So we said, okay, something is happening. What's going on? Maybe we need some more information. And the reason there was a 6 months hiatus is that this is the COVID lockdown, first COVID lockdown. So, excuse me, the first indicator that we had a problem was that our plants had died totally. They were totally dead. And we hypothesized that this was because these were nursery plants bought in a nursery supplying rich people to the north of the city. There was absolutely no acclimation available. We said, right, what we would do is let's try and get local plants. So we walked down to the Yipske River. I think it was great. There were 2 professors and a local person, and we had shovels and forks, and we dug up these plants out of the river basin. They were exactly the same species, but what they are is they've climate acclimated to this very, very high pollution load. So we figured they probably wouldn't die straight away. We then also realized that probably people didn't know how to use our wetland. Now, this area has a lot of people from very, very different backgrounds. We know we have Angolans here, and we have Mozambique people, and neither of them can necessarily speak any South African languages apart from Shangaan. So we couldn't put up an English poster because it may not work. So we said, okay, let's work with infographics. And this chap here is a guy called Goodwill, and he also designed that little URBWAT logo, and we commissioned him to do a painting adjacent. This is someone's wall, it's their shack. And we commissioned him to do this. This is how you use it. Step 1, you do your washing. Step 2, don't you pull out the plants. And step 3 is you put your water in this inlet area. So this time what we found is that the wetlands worked, which is great. We were seeing that the plants weren't dying, but what we did notice was that our usage was low. And these ladies are a specific thing. I'd like you to just note their posture. And the lady on the left is a different tap. The lady on the right is actually at our wetland. So notice these postures and notice the size of this bucket that this lady is doing washing. And I'll come back to this now. So the first wetland with this redesign system, we were seeing 90% removal of the fecal bacteria, specifically looking at E. coli. This is a log scale graph on the left, so it looks like there's not a lot of removal, but because it's log scale, it's actually 90% removal. And on the right, we have a graph of chemical oxygen demand, which is an indicator of organic matter that's in the system. And on average, the removal was about 60%. So this was great. We knew our systems were working, and we said, okay, let's now rejig them and make them right. And these are our engineering designs for the third wetland, which we then built, but we extended wetland 2 to include a second portion. But now what's changed is and wetland 1 as well, we had this long drainage area beyond it. But what you can see is this tap area we entirely redesigned. And this was done on the basis of an ergonomic study that we collaborated with human movement scientists at the University of Rhodes University in Grahamstown. And the reason for this was what they typically do at these universities, or in these, sorry, there's an ambulance going past, I can't hear myself. Or police, it's potentially anything. I think that's fine. So what human movement science people do is they typically work with sports people or with occupational health and safety people to say, how can you either do your sport better and be stronger and fitter, or if you're in an office, how do you avoid injuries? And so they're often looking at the posture of people. And that's exactly what we then did, was we looked at the postures of those ladies, which you can't see me, but bent over to do their washing. So that's not a very comfortable position to hold for a long period of time. And we said, well, how can we change that? And that's why we have these raised areas now. And what this was about was these buckets are really heavy. That big bucket on the left there that I'm highlighting, that weighs about 100 kilograms if it's full of water and washing. I can't possibly lift that. What's to tilt it into our engineered initial system? What's the chance that a washing lady can do it? And the answer is none. And so what we did was we did this and we saw vastly improved access to these systems. And you can see by building a wall, we channeled sewage away from the people. And this actually became a bit of a communal area now because we had some infrastructure. People could sit, they could enjoy a moment to chat with their friends while other people were doing washing. So this was great. So then we had to re-ask the question. So this is not a normal engineering approach. Normally engineers build something and you give it to people and you walk away and it works or it doesn't work. So we'd gone back and we'd done this iterative design loop where we'd redesigned. We said, is it working? And the answer was yes. We could see that we had all our oxygen used up, which meant we had active degradation of organic matter. And we also had pH neutralization, which was great. But what we weren't able to see was coliform bacteria removal. And this is very difficult now because what we think was happening, that our systems were overwhelmed. In the mornings, we saw huge quantities, huge numbers of people using our systems. And we hypothesized that the pulses of E. coli were still traveling through the systems when we started to do our samples. So we have no real sense of it. The uncertainty is based about lack of representative sampling. So what were our key lessons from this site? So the first key lesson was that we were victims of our own success. By making systems easy to use, they can rapidly be overwhelmed and overloaded. So that's important from an engineering perspective or science perspective. If you're going to design a system with a certain number of people in mind, if it's too useful, you better be thinking about how you can roll that system out across multiple locations, because otherwise your system will break. Second thing was low maintenance systems or not no maintenance systems. And maintenance requires energy from people and very clear lines of responsibility. So this is around management. So without management, it's very difficult to get these things to work on a longer term basis. Third lesson was that it's very difficult to work in rapidly changing contexts, increase in urban density, kids poking around in our system. This made it very difficult to do the science. Just put your probe down and you turn around and the kid's holding up your probe, being like, oh, okay, come with me, rather have a look at what we're doing than playing with it. And the fourth thing, and this is a lesson for the states, not the US, but our state and the different layers of governance, is that service delivery failures rapidly overwhelm any other attempt to remedy the problem. So on the left, you see this is a sewer that was leaking just upstream from our site. And this ran for about 4 or 5 months adjacent to our site. And part of our design was to create this as a walkway so that the people using this area wouldn't have to step through sewage, which is really important in the country where we have annual deaths from cholera. So we had other challenges in our society. One of the big ones is acid mine drainage. It's a result of mining activities in sulfide-rich ore bodies. For those who don't know what pyrite is, it's called fool's gold. And I guess the question can be asked is, who's the fool? This results in the generation of acid solutions, which can be very, very difficult to manage. So a little bit of technical work, really don't stress about the chemistry, but what you get is you get fool's gold, you add water, you add oxygen, and you add microbes. This is often bacterially mediated. And what you end up with is rusty iron, sulfate, and acidity. And this acidity is really the problem because it does all sorts of other things. The decant or drainage of this acid from the mine into the environment is termed acid mine or acid rock drainage. And the causes are well documented globally as well as within the South African context. We can solve the problem using physical, chemical, biological processes, can utilize plants or microbes if you go biologically to effect some kind of remediation. And typically what we do is we do this backward shuttle of the chemistry that you saw in the first one, where you take sulfate and a microbe and you give them some kind of a food source, some kind of a carbohydrate, which the Dutch are particularly good at this. They use ethanol, but you can use almost any organic substrate. And if you take away oxygen, these microbes use this, basically this oxygen in the sulfate, and they release carbonate, which is quite good because it's a little bit of alkalinity, it raises the pH, and they make H2S. H2S is an environmental pollutant. It's not a great one, but in my context, I'm thinking, well, you know, if I've one really bad one and one less really bad one, but the H2S is poisonous. But what you could also do is you can precipitate it out on iron. So there are ways of managing this rotten egg gas. But this is typically what you'll find in any marshy system in the world. When you start smelling marsh gas and rotten eggs, it's this anaerobic activity. So these are one of the ways of solving this. We tested it. We used charcoal or slag-based constructed wetlands. We had a look what would happen if we just left the grass in it, and it turns out it works. And then, so what we did was we said, well, maybe we can flip this coin. Maybe the acid isn't a problem. Maybe it's a resource. So our question became, what is sulfuric acid used for? And it turns out that it can be used to pre-treat cellulose for enzymatic digestion. So as a point of explanation, our current biofuels are primarily made from food or starch or sugar products. We haven't managed to turn biofuels or make biofuels from cellulose, which is the cell walls of plants, except by burning the biomass. These cellulosic biomasses are called second generation biofuels, and they're typically the holy grail for the biofuel industry because there's vastly more cellulose available than these sugars that you get from the crops themselves. And this is a particularly important point in a country where food security is not ensured. You don't want to be diverting wheat to ethanol to remediate your sulfate-rich waters. And the reason we want biofuels is because batteries are heavy and they have a low power density. So when you're looking at things like electric vehicles, the batteries are big, bulky things, and they don't get you very far. And that's why internal combustion engines are still around, even though we know that we shouldn't be using them. It's because the energy density of a fuel is much higher than on a battery. So whilst they're not going to be the future energy solution, they will certainly be part of the energy mix. And we were trying to find a cellulosic substrate near our site, and we tried to use the acid in the AMD to hydrolyze it. And this turned out to be possible. We successfully made glucose from cellulose, and we could easily ferment the glucose to ethanol alcohol. So we then said, okay, we need to integrate these ideas using multiple waste or bioproducts from various industries to create a process to remediate acid mine drainage. So specifically, we use metallurgical slags, which have a lot of alkalinity. And in this slide, you can see an acid mine drainage storage dam. And in the beakers on the left, we have raw AMD. And we were able to use slag and bagasse to treat it. And in fact, that's what our treated AMD looks like at the bottom. What's really nice about this project is that this is actually a discharge limit. So we could actually put that into the environment, which is fantastic. But what's more interesting, in fact, for me than this, was that while we were doing this project, we discovered that the AMD has a stack of critical minerals which leaches out of the rocks, those same rocks which generate the acid, that we can extract, or at least try to. So the problems are not necessarily always problems. Sometimes they are opportunities. We just have to change our perspectives. And I've spoken about this project last week, which we got a lot of follow-on funding from the Danish International Development Agency, and we're still collaborating with the University of Copenhagen. So I want to talk about changing perspectives. And I think this is where it's important to discuss what we're trying to do. This is walking into the wild, getting out of the comfort of our home disciplines. So I guess the question is, what are our water problems? When I say our, I'm specifically speaking about South Africa. And we've got many. We have poorly maintained and failing sewage treatment plants and sewerage infrastructure. This leads to untreated sewage entering our river systems. We have concomitant health problems such as cholera. Last year, we lost 36 people to cholera, which should not happen in the 21st century. And we also have a lot of theft and vandalization of public infrastructure. In addition to this, we have poorly maintained and failing drinking water systems. If anyone's reading the news, Johannesburg is under extreme stress at the moment. Many places in the city don't have water as we speak. And that's really not around supply challenges, it's around reticulation and poorly maintained infrastructure. But when we do this, what happens is that it becomes increasingly difficult to treat the water that's impacted by sewage to drinking quality. We have this aging infrastructure. Leaks are an enormous problem. We currently have 46% non-revenue water in Johannesburg. That's lost to leakage and theft. And then just because we don't have enough problems, we also have industrial, urban, and agricultural contamination, which is all lumped in with acid mine drainage. And this massive impact of mine water to our resources has a very long-term cost associated with it. And what's probably more important, and we're not identifying this as important, is there are now new things entering into our system which we know very little about. Firstly, because of the analytical difficulty of finding these things. And secondly, because there's a significant amount of global uncertainty. And these are things like microplastics, PFAS, pharmaceuticals. And this is going to be increasingly important for us to know about as we try and solve our problems, because we may end up poisoning ourselves with these things if we don't have a grip on them. But it's not just a South African problem. This is the Citarum River in Indonesia. It's a river relied upon by millions, and it too is choked with chemicals and rubbish. So this leads us to this research interface. And I really like this photo because I don't think fixing our water problems is hard. This is at Cape Canaveral. I was really lucky. I took that photo. And I'm not promoting Elon Musk in any way, but this is the SpaceX Falcon Dragon combination, where both were used and were successfully returned to Earth for the first time. And this is actually the rocket coming back. This is a difficult technical challenge. This is really hard. Fixing a wastewater treatment plant is not. So in terms of fixing our problems, this is hard. But solving the water problems requires the co-solving of other problems. South Africa and many other places in the world has many very serious challenges to its provision of water. If you ask people what they are, they can include population growth. Currently, we're expanding by about 1 million people a year, so we're currently approaching 64 million people. They include climate change, poor governance, corruption, poverty, weak education systems, rolling electrical blackouts, lack of trust. But none of these are water problems. These are all socio-economic problems. And the problem with the water sector is causality and the engineering approach towards the application of the solutions. These are the problems that are exceptionally hard to fix. And in fact, I think solving these problems is substantially harder than landing the rocket back on the launch pad. So what we are trying to do is solve the symptoms, but not the causes. The orange and blue overlap on this graph, this diagram, it's a wonderful engineering approach, is the sweet spot where engineers are able to get it right. Engineers and scientists solve very clearly defined problems on the basis of a clear set of assumptions. For example, a town of 100,000 people needs the provision of potable water and for the sewage to be treated. The designers will assume that the population will grow or not, that the cost will be shared somehow amongst the population, and they will then design according to a set of rules for how much water is required to support this population. But there are also some implicit assumptions that are not necessarily stated outright until fairly recently, like the need for electricity. What engineers do not plan for is a change in government that may deprioritize the maintenance budgets and thereby extend the designs beyond their intended lifespans. And that's not just a South African problem. If you want to, you can read up about the schools in Great Britain that are falling down because the concrete has reached the end of its lifespan. Engineers also do not necessarily design for a massively increased population to be plugged into the system without proper consideration of extension or upgrade. The causality of extremely dynamic social pressures are not well suited to being incorporated into the design space. Normally, the designer will include a buffer capacity, and that's normally based on professional judgment, but it's not always sufficient. But it is also my belief that our sector is trapped. The engineers and scientists are trapped trying to solve problems they have no control over. The levers of society are not wastewater treatment. They are the disciplines of law, they're the disciplines of governance and of economics. And I hate to say it, politics. Engineers can only solve problems if they have budget. And that budget comes from the fiscus. The budget will only arrive if society values the commodity. The reason we have a terrible state of water resources and almost all other publicly owned infrastructure in South Africa is that a low value is placed on the infrastructure by our society. Given our history of state capture under the Zuma administration, is it any surprise that we ascribe no value to the commons given their risk of capture? The levers of society are not really trying to change the status quo. And I have that again, the levers are not changing things. So I need to segue into this picture now. This photograph is Eagle Creek wildfire close to Beacon Rock Golf Course in Washington, the US in 2017. For me, this is the defining picture of the 20th century. In fact, of the 21st century so far as well. It links the climate crisis and its most immediate effect upon us, which is on water resources. And yeah, I mean, every time I look at this, I'm caught again because I see a bunch of dudes playing golf, which is one of the most water-thirsty sports you get, while the world burns around them. And I think that picture describes what's wrong right now, more than any other picture I can think of. But I also think in many ways the present has not changed from the past. And I'm going to quote from Lao Tzu, from the Tao Te Ching, and I'm probably going to do this twice. So the wise soul governing people would empty their belly, empty their minds, and fill their bellies, weaken their wishes, strengthen their bones, keep people unknowing, unwanting, keep the ones who do know from doing anything. When you do not doing, nothing is out of order. I'll say it again. So the wise soul governing people would empty their minds, fill their bellies, weaken their wishes, strengthening their bones, keep people unknowing, unwanting, keep the ones who do know from doing anything. When you do not doing, nothing is out of order. And I think that's the political lesson we see all around us, because the wise souls are doing that for us. So that's depressing. That's all the past. But I think the future is promising. In May 1992, Christopher McCandless was getting lost in the wild. The critical thing about Chris's getting lost, was that when he crossed the Teclanica River, the water was low. It is known that he wanted to return to society. However, the spring thaw was too great and the river flooded, preventing his return. Having discarded his map, he was ignorant of the existence of other crossing points nearby. And the lessons here are simple. Ignorance is bliss, but deadly. And the water was unpredictable and trapped him. And it is not possible to survive on your own. I think all three of these lessons apply equally to water research. So how do they come into play? And I believe we need new ways to communicate science meaningfully across the disciplines. So I made these pinch pots. My wife took me for ceramics lessons, and whilst I wasn't very excited about making the pot, I actually realized I found glazing a particularly interesting thing, especially with my background in chemistry and metallurgical processes. And of course, I have access to these really unusual environmental contaminants. So the pot on the left, this very black dark one, it represents this AMD seep on the far left. So what I did was I took a concentration of water in there, and I put it into this dish, did it 3 times, and then I fired it. This is drinking water on the right. And what I then did was I used drinking water 3 times, and I did the same. And these represent different concentrations. And the reason I did this, and I think this is useful, because it's a way of using art to communicate science. What does 15 grams per liter and 2 grams of sulfate look like? If you don't have a scientific background, that's a really abstract concept. Whereas if you look at that, you can say, well, that's 15 grams per liter of sulfate. And the reason for me that I think this is important is that engineering and science don't directly influence society. Art, economics, politics, law, they're the influences. Science and engineering respond to the influences. So until the levers of society, until people in society value water, water is not valued. It's just another commodity until we don't have enough. And then it's everything. So because water is so important for all of us, there exists the opportunity for us to use it to break the barriers of knowledge. We have water law, we have water science, we have water governance, we have water politics, we have water economics, we have water engineering, but we don't have degrees in water, primarily because water is so central to all our disciplines. It ends up being subordinate to all specializations. And I believe, and this is really where I'm leading today's lecture to, is that we're at the cusp where we need a rationale to start thinking about new degree programs. And I think that speaks really well to the UNO-Africa partnership and towards a future of knowledge where maybe we don't have faculties and we don't have schools. I think that the provision of water knowledge globally is not coherent and in line with the needs of society or the sector. I think it's subordinate again to these other disciplines. So most of the knowledge that water professionals acquire is actually informally acquired. It's acquired through working in the space or through reading. And I think we need to create this 21st century of professionals who have water as central to their education. And in fact, I think we could go one step better. And this is very, very fluffy, but we could have maybe schools of the elements: earth, fire, wind, and water, because those are the four, the Greek or the ancient elements are the ones that truly require interdisciplinary in order to solve our problems that we face today. Where fire is energy, water is water, earth is earth sciences, and air is atmospheric sciences. What could it look like? It could look something like this, where, you know, we have a diagram with the water resource, and actually what you have is every water professional in this space would be educated in all of these disciplines at the same time, with some kind of a specialization later on. And what you could have, what I really want is, I want lawyers who understand chemistry. I want engineers who know what dignity is. And I want chemists to understand what an engineering system is. For me, that's the way this future should be, if we're going to meaningfully engage with these problems. Because at the moment, I think all of us feel like outsiders and none of us really know what's happening. So that's kind of a schematic of what I think a future degree could look like, where you can plug into existing domains or silos of knowledge, but that you have them flowing through, and I use that word very carefully, flowing throughout a new academic program. So in conclusion, these are photos I took in Svetla, and I think they're important photos. Africa is poised to grow by another 2 billion people in the next 50 years. For this future to be water secure, there has to be deeper engagement across all of our knowledge domains. I see this as critical for ensuring global security. The impact of climate change is most keenly felt on our water resources. This has significant follow-up impacts, not least of which is on food security. As we see our peak population pass, the challenges associated with feeding 10 billion humans, whilst addressing all our legacy impacts, is going to take considerable resolve. I think integrating all of our knowledge is going to be critical towards doing that. This is a slide. Again, this is a photograph of the eastern Highveld river, which was really pretty. It's a great summer photograph. And for me, that's what our rivers should actually look like. And most important, there's two funding agencies I really want to thank: the Claude Leon Foundation for the sponsorship of my chair, and for the they're also co-funding our grant, our conference next year. And also for this lecture series, the IIES and the Europa Africa Partnership, because that's how I'm able to be here to share this with you and to meet people here at the Babylonian University. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Any questions on that?
I can't, there, I've got it bigger. How do I maximize the meeting window? Cool. Going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. So maybe I should do the questions rather than from somewhere on the side. Daryl, Diesel, there's a thing. Thank you. Lots of food for thought. Thanks, Neve. It's not necessarily a technical presentation, but really, in many ways, more it's a call to arms towards solving these problems. Because as an engineer, I just can't solve these problems. And the more I learn, the more I feel I'm hopelessly ill-equipped towards solving what I think are the real problems. Yes. Who's raised their hand? Oh, Julian. Hi, Julian.
Hi, Craig. Good morning. Thanks very much. That was a very insightful, interesting presentation. Actually, I joined about 2 minutes late, so I missed the title. So I really didn't know what I was in for, and I really enjoyed it. Really insightful. It was an emotional journey through my breakfast, but I learned a lot as well. I have one or two simple questions just to go back to Silvertown. What happened in the end? I mean, where are they now? And also, I thought that aerial photograph was very interesting. Significant changes over a very short period of time. It also seemed that there was a hierarchy in the Silvertown itself, in that in the newer picture or the most recent one, there was a number of larger, bigger buildings closer to the river. There seemed to be a lot of small buildings, but then as you went further away, they seemed to occupy larger and larger I don't know, roof space, I'll say. That's what I could see. So do they have different water, or if I could say, water management systems? Those newer ones, are they built with any water management in mind?
Okay, so I'm going to try and answer your questions. Let me just see if I can get back to this slide. Is that it, Julian? The right slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question of what happened is a really important question, and I'm particularly sore about what happened, because in many ways, when you do these development projects in the global south, especially in an unplanned settlement like this, you see donor funding coming in and people do all the research and they leave, and then the thing implodes afterwards. So for me, I'm particularly sore because we built organically, and when I say organically, to the point where, as a very obvious outsider, I was able to walk through this community unmolested and it wasn't strange. So I could just drive there and walk through this community without alerting anyone because everyone knew me, which is astonishing in the South African context. And part of the follow-on was we presented this data to what we call the stakeholders, which is the city of Johannesburg, it was the Water Research Commission, it was our funders who were the Department of Science and Innovation, because this was EU funding that did a lot of the work. And so the city of Joburg is a city in crisis. There is no governance. So whilst they were very interested, there's been absolutely no engagement with this or in solving these problems for everyone. The second was our Department of Science and Innovation said, oh, please, you have to apply for a follow-on grant called ISASTAT, which is the European South Africa Science and Technology something platform. I can't remember. I'm not good at acronyms. And we wrote a proposal immediately based on that call. And about 2 months ago, I sent a fairly pointed email back to them saying, I'm sorry, it's 2 years later. You've not awarded it. I don't believe you're acting in good faith by offering this funding. Therefore, we withdraw our application. And they said, no, it's going to be awarded in a week's time. So I said, fine, leave it for a week. And 3 weeks later, nothing had happened. So I've just left it and nothing has come back. That's our government being negligent with European funding. So for me, that's extremely disappointing. And I can't go back because the relationships you need to work in this area are continuously active. So we would go there, we'd have meetings with people, we'd take Ellen, like seed trays of tomato plants, because that's how you build links with people. You can't just arrive unannounced every time. And obviously, without that funding, we were not able to do that. So literally, our relationship with Svetla has gone stale, and therefore, I actually told our government to go. No, I won't tell you what I won't tell you what I thought, but I basically withdrew the application for funding because I thought it was unethical that we were in that application. So that's the first question that you asked me. The second question you're asking me is about this population density in this top section here being any different to this area. And the answer is no. And in fact, it's particularly interesting because what's going on is you have illegal rubble disposal on this west bank of the river. So what happens is that you have construction work elsewhere. The guys come in with their dump trucks and they dump the rubble on this bank, and then people build houses on there. And then with time, this river, because it's the gradients are the bank with the fastest flow is typically the right bank, these settlements are starting to fall in the river. But these people have no agency to do anything about this. So for them, this is an external thing that the river just happens to wash them away. So I've stood on this bridge watching these houses, literally watching these houses fall in the water. It's quite shocking. But no, there's no socioeconomic status whatsoever or difference in status. What is happening is many of these shacks are becoming double-story shacks now, and that's quite interesting. And then what happens is that in the wetlands that I showed you, where we had those taps, maybe I can see one of the community taps there. This standpipe was a municipal standpipe that was given to the community. But these people are very enterprising. So what they'll do is they'll cut a pipe and then they'll like develop their own reticulation networks into the community, all informal. And this is why we have such high non-revenue water. It's partly why. So that tap then services a whole area. So people then get washing machines and they put them in their shacks. And an example of that is on this graph, you can see that's this shack here. They built a washing machine. So he just popped his washing machine outfalls directly into our wetland because it was there. So it's all entirely informal. There's absolutely no structure. There's no planning. There's nothing. And it's as people accumulate possessions, they then, and also small amounts of money, they then start to formalize this. On the left of him, you can see it's a brick wall now. They will discard their tin and they will build bricks, and then the tin goes onto the roof, or it gets used somewhere else. But no socioeconomic stratification. This is all very, very poor area. But as you can see in this next slide, some of the people do have cars. So, and also in this slide, you can see there's a whole bank of cars at the back. So it's not that economically impoverished that people don't have transport. Cool. I'm going to just, yeah.
Just another follow-on question. You did mention that everyone that you were engaged with in the community, or at least for the community meetings, were women. And I wondered about that. Was it A, they were most commonly there, B, they were the ones using the water, so they were the best to engage with, and they were going to be the ones who were adopting, as you can see here in the picture, using it for washing? Or was there other reasons why it was only women?
No, it was women because they were more interested. I think that's it. The men were typically sitting outside their shacks, throwing dice and drinking beer. So, I mean, it sounds like a 21st century cliche, but it's really why I believe developing women leads to better outcomes for societies, because they tend to be more engaged and more interested, especially in these types of contexts. Cool.
Thanks.
Pleasure. I hope I answered your question, Julian.
Yeah, you did. I think you did. Yeah. For certain. I'm even as you were answering it, I was thinking it's a really interesting for a planner to follow how these unplanned communities develop into, if I can say it, eventually formal communities, I assume.
So I agree, and I think there's a whole big learning here, and specifically, so there's one UK and one European context I'm particularly interested to learn more about. So the one is, if you go to some of these places like in the Cotswolds, where they're so beautiful, but they're actually no different to Svetla. And all that's different is the materials of construction were stone and thatch when they were built. So how did those societies retrospectively get sewage and sanitation and water services? Because this is a fairly recent, it's a fairly recent innovation from a human perspective. So when I'm sitting in a university which has been here since 1400, there was no sewage. The rivers were your sewers. So there are learnings to be had And the second one that I think is particularly interesting is a city such as Porto, because those little houses coming up the hills are really, am I allowed to say they're like favelas, I guess, but they're all sewered and plumbed. And if you look at when they were built, that's exactly the same building style. It's unplanned. You know, you basically build where you could. So I think that there's definitely scope for us to have a look at the global north and to think about how did these medieval villages engage with sanitation systems towards solving some of their problems. And can we then retrospectively apply some of that knowledge in the global south with full knowledge that it's an entirely different system, but there may be some learnings for us there that I think we're not thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thanks, Judy. Are there any other questions? We have one in the room. Yeah, okay.
More,
That's fine. I'll repeat it for everyone.
comment on the question, but maybe a question also at the same time. I have an impression of having a kind of deja vu. And this is very great. Once I took part is what they call an external advisor, the EU-funded project called IChemE, or at least wastewater project. And the story was the following: there's a problem with wastewater in cities. Engineers are working; they propose a solution. The solution is costly. Then you have to collect the money. The money is public, and then you have to raise fiscal rates or something. And then you have, of course, say to the politicians, it's a problem of communicating certain things to society that they would understand, that they have to have this idea. So one of our conclusions was, and it was done by a colleague of mine from the University of Belfast. Because the economy is working on nudges. So I think the pushes, which are by default promoting the people behave in a certain way and in an alternative way. Right? It's a kind of new trend in economics to create solutions in that way that people do certain things in a given way, not in a different way. So, and this is one of the challenges which is probably, they will say, is that interdisciplinary, but it's transdisciplinary in the sense that you not only have to communicate your outputs from engineers to economists, from economists to lawyers and decision makers and politicians in society, but you also have to have include even this negative feedback from different groups and try to strengthen dialogue, explain your in the language which is understandable from the other side. And this is a communication problem very often. Because especially, I would say, especially in hard science and the rest, it's easier to explain. I would say, Marcy, she explains a lot of things about to me, and sometimes I do understand. Right? I think it's easier to understand the plot of a given book than different chemical formulas and why they are dangerous or what kind of risks are implicitly or explicitly there behind surface denial. So this is something that is I don't know how to do this, honestly speaking. I'm even facing this problem with lawyers because we have a very dynamic language, legal language, which is very formal. And we as lawyers, we very often have to rather work as translators or interpreters of what the law says to a regular citizen. Because if you have a client, usually a client is not a non-lawyer. And so I think this job is even more complicated and more demanding in case of where you are, engineering, chemistry, where this language is even less understandable for a layman.
So if you didn't hear, yeah, I'm never going to repeat it, but yeah, the gist of the comment was around like figuring out how to nudge society to, which is like small input, large response, I guess. And the second was around the communication of science. And we have Megan. Megan is online. Hi, Megan. Megan is actually appointed by our school as a scientific communication specialist. And I think this is really important. And the second thing I noticed about this science communication was my child is doing science at school. And what I had forgotten is that science is a language which is now implicit to the way I view the world. And watching my child learn science, I realized there's an entire communication system which I'd actually forgotten I had to learn because the stuff is innate in the way I see the world. And I think, and maybe this is not contentious, but I really think going forward, we have to raise science as a language into our schooling systems in its own way. Scientific literacy is not a trivial thing. It's a really important thing. So if we have to learn English and a second language and maths, why are we not learning science as a fourth language? And the reason I say that is we're increasingly going into a world which is entirely governed with technology, and science underpins all of it. And I apologize for anyone who disagrees with me on this, but if you don't believe in the efficacy of vaccines because you have an opinion about that and a different thing, it means you're not scientifically literate, and it means you haven't got sufficient science knowledge or literacy. And I think that's one of the ways we could do this, is teach more science at school. And that even this degree program for me is part of that, where I don't want to be interpreting chemistry to lawyers. I want, when there's an environmental contamination issue and they say, well, what does it mean when it's 3 or 4 nanograms per liter? I would rather the lawyers are saying, this is 3 nanograms per liter. Do you know anyone who can tell us whether that's harmful to human health? And I think that's a far more meaningful dialogue as a science expert, because we think quite differently. And the nudges, I agree. And I think nudges links to metastable states, and that's climate is also one of these metastable states. So you have, they call them tipping points. So you run along a point of metastability and you nudge it and it moves to an entirely new steady state. And I think it's useful to think of that analogy as nudges, and it's just figuring out where the nudges are. But generally speaking, engineers haven't got a clue apart from like, oh, that's a cool technology, let's use it. Because absolutely the nudges, we need to chase the nudges. They're the wins. They're the low-hanging fruit. I think Marcy had a question. Oh, okay. Cool. And Lena has a question.
Maybe I.
In general, I just wanted to find out this question of certification, because this is something that our colleague from the University of Zurich is talking about, and we often disagree. Because I find it hard to find the balance between the engagement of society, which is by default non-scientific engagement, and produce meaningful results. Obviously, you need to do both. But sometimes you put a lot of work into projects which are more symbolic than, for example, you're making a small obviously then impact is going to be personal space. Secondly, that archaeology scientifically literate, and what I'm a little bit concerned about is that the idea of competition is created by a lot of people focus on transdisciplinarity as opposed to interdisciplinarity, and it's trying to elevate the weight we afford to those unscientific approaches. And I'm trying to this is something that I haven't figured out yet, how to get that society is included, but we also are in the genetic grants that we're making in a simple way. One more thing, when it comes to that, I think that this is the similar dilemma comes with polarization science. I know quite a few people who have listened to a lot of popular science and say podcasts or presentations. They feel experts now. So it's very hard to, even though they are interested in science in theory, it's very hard to choose their understanding because they feel very scientific. So this is another thing decided to have to approach. Yes, I find it quite interesting when I look, especially for example, comments on YouTube after reading some popular science in the commentaries. I have no idea how to approach that. But, yeah, I don't know if it was any different in your work.
Yes, it does. It does and it doesn't, is the answer. So the question is about opinions of science and how do you include experts that are self-styled, I guess, in your decision-making process. So the way I would approach these things is you need a solution for a problem. So your first thing is, what is your problem? So in my instance, the problem is sanitation. I've got to get sewage out of the system and I've got to get it treated because people are going to die. So I'm going to work off a couple of assumptions, and those will hold true regardless of what your opinion is. So I believe in the germ theory of disease. Therefore, cholera will give you cholera with a 10% chance if you contract it, you might die. I don't care what your opinion is about any of that. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you wastewater treatment systems. Where your co-creation of knowledge then sits on the front end of that basic assumption. Here are different options that you could engage with. Would you like this one or this one or this one? What are your issues with them? How would they work? So we can incorporate elements of your worldview into that problem, but not necessarily into the point, which is we have to solve the problem. And I think that's the worldview we have to block, where no, I don't believe there's a problem. Climate change is not real. This is not a scientific debate. This is a political debate entirely. It's now fallen away from every other domain of knowledge. So we should not afford any politicians any leeway in speaking about climate change. Climate change is here. Therefore, when we're going to solve it, it's not like do nothing. That's not one of the solutions. Actually, we deny that existence in the co-creation of our knowledge. So it's about pressing, I shouldn't say that word as an academic, but there should be a suppression of nonsense. And that's why, like, if anyone says to me, I don't believe in vaccines, I'm like, good. Please die. That's the consequence of your opinion. And actually, my response to you is we will be vaccinated for measles and a whole bunch of other diseases because I don't want to die. You're welcome to it. But actually, maybe the hospitals that my tax covers shouldn't pay for your treatment if you're going to choose that. So I don't want to deny your agency, but actually, I don't accept that premise. So there is a balance there. Maybe we need to take this one offline. Cool. I guess we're almost done. Sarah, is there anyone else online, or do we have any further questions? I don't see anything really.
No, I think we're all good online. Thank you so much, Craig. It's a really interesting presentation.
Cool, and we've gone over time. I apologize to everyone. Cool. Okay. Well, I think we're done here. I wish you all a wonderful morning, day, evening, etc., wherever you are. And please dial in for the next presentation, which is next week, which is Professor Schweder. Piotr. Okay, cool, everyone. Chat soon. Bye.